Sorry, we're starting a minute late. We'll go ahead and we'll call the meeting to order. We are going to have a closed session just ahead of the Operations Committee report a little later this evening. Other than that, there are no other agenda changes, except we'll definitely have Operations be the last committee of the evening, so we'll bump that down, Personnel Policy Committee up, and then we'll have a quick close before we get to the Operations business in Mr. McDonald's committee. With that, I will ask the clerk to please call the roll.
Mrs. Gorel? Present. Mr. Hoffman? Present. Mr. Kelly?
Here.
Mr. McDonald?
Present.
Mr. Neighbors? Mrs. Red?
Present.
Mr. Salgado?
Present.
Mr. Schultz? Mr. Tassoni?
Present.
Mr. Webster?
Here.
Mr. Westcott?
Present.
Mr. Arena?
Here.
Mr. Billich?
Here.
Mr. Booker?
Here.
Mr. Boomer? Mr. Butita?
Here.
Mrs. Crosby?
Here.
Mr. Fellers?
Here.
Mr. Fiducia? Mr. Girl?
Present.
3 absent, 17 present, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you very much, Clerk Umau. So we have, under invocation, we have we're going to ask everybody as we stand, we're going to have a moment of silence, and I'll explain why. Correction officer has passed away November 11th, 2019. His name was Jason Pullman, and he had been with the county since April 2006. And as we stand, we will start with a moment of silence, and then we will ask Mrs. Crosby to lead us in the invocation and the pledge. So with that, we'll ask everybody to stand for a moment of silence, please.
Dear Lord, I pray that you guide us always, satisfy the needs that need to be met during this meeting. Strengthen us to make tough decisions. I pray that we will be fruitful. Please guide us so that this meeting can be productive, effective, compassionate, and decisive. Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Crosby. Our next item of business, public comment. We have 2 speakers tonight, Josh Morgan and Justin Zog. I'm going to ask Mr. Morgan from WREX to come on up here, and I believe he has some remarks related to open and closed session.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the time. My name is Josh Morgan. I'm the station manager at 13 WREX. I spoke to some of you at the operations and administrative meeting last month. Months ago, the 13 WREX team requested the Attorney General's Public Access Bureau review recordings and minutes from a closed session on May 2nd about the 911 agreement with municipalities, as we believed this conversation violated the Illinois Open Meetings Act. The Public Access Bureau agreed, and on August 21st, an Assistant Attorney General concluded the Illinois Open Meetings Act was violated and sent the state's attorney's office and committee chairs Keith McDonald and Jaime Salgado her decision, which included a request to release the closed session material to 13 WREX. It has now been 85 days since that decision concluded. The majority of this group sitting here violated state law. And yet, no action. The only action taken was when Mr. Kurlinkus filed an appeal to the Attorney General's decision, a move, according to the AG's office, that is against protocol. Yet, in the end, that appeal was denied too. But here's something new I would like to share with you tonight. Before that appeal, Mr. McDonald promised us, on the record, he would get the documents released within 60 days of the AG's opinion. We took him at his word, and we waited. On day 56, the day I spoke to the committee, I told Mr. McDonald that our next step would be to file an official complaint against the county board and state's attorney if the documents were not released. And that's where it gets interesting. After the 60 days passed and nothing had been released, we contacted an attorney about filing that lawsuit. However, we were told a lawsuit could only be filed within 60 days of the Attorney General's ruling. So think about that. We were promised these materials by the committee chairman within 60 days of the ruling. When that did not happen, we tried to file a lawsuit and could not, because it had to be filed within those same 60 days. So before I leave tonight, I'd ask you to consider these questions. Was that promise made in good faith? Did Mr. McDonald know our legal recourse expired after 60 days?
Mr. Morgan, please direct your comments to the entire board.
Did Ms. Height-Ross and this entire board, along with Mr. Kurolinkus, advise Mr. McDonald to give us that 60-day deadline? And I ask you to consider these questions because the state's attorney's office refuses to answer our questions. In fact, her office has not granted WREX an interview in more than 6 months. Maybe she'll answer your questions. And let's not forget who appointed Ms. Height-Ross to her position. Many of you sitting on this board. It has been 167 days since 2 county committees violated state law. It has been 85 days since the Attorney General's office requested that recordings and documents from that closed session be released. Walter Cronkite once said, our job is only to hold up the mirror, to tell and show the public what has happened. When you look in that mirror,
Mr. Morgan, we're at 3 minutes, sir. I do appreciate your comments. Mr. Boomer.
I think we need to read the personal attack stuff prior to somebody coming up and speaking.
Thank you. Our next speaker this evening is Justin Zog, and he is going to be speaking about fairness across the county. He's a resident of Winnebago County. I will read the disclaimer Mr. Boomer referenced. Comments shall be limited to 3 minutes. Speakers may not address a zoning matter or pending before the ZBA zoning committee or county board. Personnel matters or pending or threatening litigation may not be addressed in open session. An individual may speak a maximum of 3 times per calendar year on the same topic. This prohibition shall include the repetition of the same topic in a statement of what is purported to be a different topic. Personal attacks or inappropriate language of any sort will not be tolerated. Thank you.
No.
Yes, sir.
Let me start by saying how disappointed the majority are. No need to introduce myself, as most of you should recognize and remember me from the last time I was up here. If you do not, I'm even more disappointed because you lacked what every single politician should have to the citizens who elected them: respect. A huge and overwhelming amount of the citizens in the Southeast are done with this county board. We are fed up and disgusted that you all sit here and allow us to live in the shadows of a billion-dollar company that has taken over the county. We're not asking anyone to shut down the landfill. We know it is needed. What we are asking would actually inject more tax dollars into our local economy, and it would create, excuse me, would create more middle-class jobs, all while improving landscape, our health, air, and water quality. Also, the overall enjoyment of life for your citizens. Let's look at the asphalt plant trying to build in Rockton. It was almost a 50-50 vote. Most of the board members that were and are against it have said things like, I care about the quality of life of our residents. You were worried about schools and anything else that comes along with it. What the hell is the difference in asphalt plant and a landfill?
Justin, thank you.
What's the difference in Rockton residents versus Southeast residents? Why are you letting the Southeast suffer while you all do nothing, but 50% of you will lobby for the Rockton residents? Are they more important than the Southeast? I ask you to do some actual research on the 2 businesses. A landfill not in compliance will harm your residents' health, home values, air quality, and overall enjoyment of life way more than an asphalt plant. I'm not a Harvard graduate. I'm not an ISU graduate. Heck, I'm not even a Rock Valley graduate. But it doesn't take many brain cells to see a pattern emerge from this board. Back to the area most of you do not care about, the Southeast. Remember, Rockton Township has about 16,000 residents. Just so you know, Cherry Valley Township has 19. I won't even try and figure out how many residents that are in the Rockford Township that are affected. Again, no Harvard graduate. But if you do not get my point by now, please do the majority of law-abiding citizens a favor and get out of politics now. I'd be more than happy to take your resignation letter to Mr. Haney myself. Stop letting your private slush fund the landfill contributes to cloud your sight and doing what is right for your Southeast residents. It's time to stop the landfill from breaking the law that you very people say you govern and support. Let me recap. Most of you do not care about your citizens in the Southeast. You only object anything that could affect quality of life to other areas of the county. And you all sit there and watch the landfill break the law each and every day. And your less cared for citizens suffered. How much more of an a-hole do I need to be for you to get my drift and actually do something? Stop letting a $1 billion corporation from Texas ruin the southeast of the county you serve. Stand up and force them to follow the law of the land. I promise you, it will bring in more money to your county and more jobs. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Webster.
Thank you. Mr. Zog is absolutely right on a number of points that he brought up there. That landfill and the host fee money that comes from it is more of an albatross to us than anything, I think, because when you think back, we did fine. The county did okay without that host fee money to begin with. And this has been going on for quite some time now. The landfill, last meeting that I sat in on when they had their company reps and then the guys from the state were there, and they admitted right there that they've been finding them on a near daily basis. And still the violations continue, day after day after day. So I don't know what the answer is, or I mean, is the state going to be able to find them to a point there to really get their attention? Because apparently these fines that they're dealing with now, to them they're just looking at it as a cost of doing business. The fines need to be on them, need to be in line with the violations and the aggravation that they've caused to the people of the county. So I would ask perhaps if Chairman Haney could send a more stern letter or whatever to the state to get them to get off the dime and do something that's going to really matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. That was our first comment under board member correspondence. Any other comments by board members? Mr. Kelly.
Yeah, I'm District 9, and that's in the Milford area, and these people are rightly mad as hell, and they don't want to take it anymore. The problem is that we have two landfills down there, one in Ogle County that we have no control or authority over whatsoever, and of course our own landfill. And both of the landfills have been in violation. Anytime there's a problem, it's very difficult to determine which landfill is causing it. And we have been pressing the state IEPA to do more about enforcing it. And we've had correspondence back and forth and have been advised that the state IEPA has tried to involve the state attorney general's office to cite both landfills for non-compliance, but so far it's been moving at a snail's pace. And I don't know what we can do to try and speed this up. They need relief. Don't need fines, they need relief. Need to get rid of the stench.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kelly. Any other comments by board members? Mrs. Crosby.
Last week, in conjunction with John Butita and including Mr. Kelly, Mr. Booker, and Mr. Fellers, we have requested that the state's attorney, through Chairman Haney, provide a resolution to put the executive form of government on the ballot. I would like to have that reviewed by a committee and brought forth for a vote. I think it's important that our citizens have a voice, and it's not just decided by an ad hoc committee or something else. It's an important issue, our governance is important, and I would surely like to think that this board would be supportive of hearing from our community. So I'm putting it on the table, and it's going to come forward, and I thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Crosby. Any other comments by board members? Seeing none, we'll move on to the chairman's report. I'll mention this. This was asked, I think, very appropriately in the last Finance Committee about things related to capital and specifically the sheriff's request for body cameras. You know, ideas from the board and from folks on funding mechanisms, and a range of options were thrown out. Some more immediate, some would be more futuristic, I guess. I would submit this is when we tie in or look at the sheriff's request for the body cameras, which I think many folks in this room support, as part of a larger capital improvement plan. I would be remiss if I didn't share what Gus Gettner reminded me of this week, our IT director. You know, there's about $10 million of IT needs over the next 5 years, and that's one piece. Then we have other capital that's been deferred at the county. We have obviously departmental capital needs, and then of course the big one, one of the big ones is the highway department and their infrastructure needs, because there's a lot of matching dollars tied to that. And I think Mr. Salgado raised a very good point in this committee. It's not a question of if the board is supportive or open to the idea of those body cameras, but how are we going to pay for it. I do think we have the luxury of a little bit of time, in that the board does not need to find funding for the year one piece, but we do need to at least offer some clarity and vote heading into the new year or before the end of this year, so that it's clear and we either take advantage of the pricing or we don't. But I would just say that one of the things I think we appropriately talked about early on in 19 was the idea of a comprehensive plan. I think we're at a point, and it's not popular, and I will be one of the people to stand next to you and take a beating on it, but I do think we're at a point where easy options are behind us, and we do have to look at bonding, and we can make that bond payment on a larger capital initiative that would include a number of those items. We have options to fill that, and I think if we had a discussion around that, it would be very productive. I'd be willing to talk or be a small part of any larger discussion on that, but I do think it's important that we address the sheriff's need. I think it's very appropriate Mr. Salgado raised the issue of how we're going to pay for it, and I appreciate that. I do think there's some options, but I don't know how we address the needs that are going to get more expensive and more critical without some bonding. I don't think we can just pay as we go, because we have not been paying as we go. And I would just put that forward. And I'm willing to talk to anybody, finance, Mr. Salgado's group, anybody on the board about that as we go forward. Number two, this got mentioned in passing in a recent discussion with Mr. Hoffman, Mr. Boomer, just kind of in passing. DeKalb County does something really cool when it comes to drawing their district maps for county board districts. And this is not a now item. This is after the census, so this is a couple years down the road. I'm going to propose that we at least take a look at what DeKalb is doing. They did what we want to do at the state level. We want to take politics out of drawing our political maps at the state level. 80% of people polled believe that pay taxes. DeKalb County took their politicians out of drawing their political districts of county board districts, meaning it was done by a commission, non-elected officials. And it actually, when you talk about the history of even city council districts, county board districts being drawn, and some tweaks to that at the last minute, I think it actually leads to some really good government and fair representation. It's not a now decision, but I'm just going to share with the board for discussion, maybe a committee, what they're doing, compare it to what we're doing, and see if that makes sense. I think it does, and obviously we got time to figure that out. The third thing I think is more topical to some of the comments this evening, the first being the landfill discussion. I would add that the Attorney General, I think this is public record, this isn't anything that's not, but Charlotte and the state's attorney's office shared that the Attorney General will be back in court with the landfill the 21st at 9 a.m. in courtroom 412. So that is related to the regulatory piece with the landfill. So that would be the 21st at 9 a.m. They will be back in court, and that is obviously one piece of the discussion, but a very critical piece related to the regulatory piece with the IEPA. The other item is, I would definitely hope we get some clarity on next steps just related to this open or closed session discussion. If we could get clarity on that this evening in the most appropriate way possible, I think that would be clear, and then we can communicate that out and people know what's coming around that item. Any comments or questions from me? Mrs. Squirrel.
Thank you, Chairman. When it comes to the redistricting, the League of Women Voters have been working on that and promoting that for a long time. That's a group you might want to have come talk to us in regards to how the redistricting, they've done a lot of research in it and how we can do that non-politically.
Thank you. We'll follow up with them as well. Any other comments, questions for me? Seeing none, thank you. We'll move on to announcements and communications. Clerk, come out.
Mr. Chairman, the items listed below are received as correspondence.
We'll go ahead and place those on file. Next item of business is our consent agenda. We have 3 items. We have our raffle report, approval of the October 10th minutes, and delay over the October 24th minutes. May I please have a motion to approve those 3 items? Mr. Hoffman on the motion, Mrs. Crosby, Mr. Fellers on the second. Thank you. Consent agenda with those 3 items is before the board. Any discussion or comment? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? Thank you very much. Motion passes unanimously. Next item of business, County Administrator's Report. Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As of tonight, I have no report, so.
Thank you very much. Next item, we have any department head updates? Tiana, Tom, Chris, Mr. Hodges.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to give the board an extremely brief update on the 2019 assessment year and where our office and the Board of Review are in that process. I did pass out a handout with some graphs and a table on it. If you refer to Figure 1, the number of property assessment complaints increased from 1,500 last year to roughly 2,600 this year. As many of you know, this is a general assessment year, and thus the number of property assessment complaints has increased accordingly and as expected. While complaints are up from last year, there are quite a bit fewer complaints than what we saw in the prior general assessment year of 2015, and significantly less than the one before that in 2011, where we had around 7,500 appeals. This difference can be attributed to a fairly strong real estate market that we've been experiencing these past few years. Moving on to Figure 2, this graph highlights the county-wide growth in equalized assessed value over the past 10 years. This is before any Board of Review action. Countywide EAV increased 6% from 2018 to 2019. Now, historically, EAV is reduced about 0.5% by the Board of Review, although that 0.5% figure may be a bit inflated by large reductions that took place earlier on in the decade due to the recession. After running a preliminary sales ratio study for 2019, all indications point to positive multipliers for 2020 and most likely 2021 as well, as we continue to climb back towards that high water mark of $5.6 billion in 2009. Table 1 has a breakdown of the number of complaints by townships, as well as additional information regarding the number of dockets requesting larger reduction amounts, along with the number of complaints by property class. The percentage of property class complaints is also reflected in Figure 3. Per usual, residential complaints make up the bulk of that total. As of this afternoon, the Board of Review has worked through and issued preliminary decisions on roughly 1,100 files out of the 2,600 assessment complaints. They are scheduled to begin hearings on Monday, November 25th. This will ramp up after Thanksgiving and throughout the month of December. Notices to the taxing districts of those properties requesting a reduction of $100,000 or greater are set to go out early next week. And we'll have hearings for those properties beginning in January and on into February. We're hoping to have the board review closed by March 1st of 2020, which should give the state ample time to certify the final multiplier to Clerk Gumau's office so that they can complete the 2019 tax extension. And that's all I have for tonight. If there's any additional information that's not on this report and that's anyone would like, please let me know, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Do you have a few extra copies, Tom?
I certainly do.
Okay, can you make sure we get those to, I think we got some media partners here.
I'd be happy to.
The only thing I'd just point to, I think is excellent, is on the top right side, the EAV. When you look at 2009, then you look at the bottom in 2015, now we've started to climb back up. I mean, we're still down 700 or 800 million in overall EAV, that's correct, between 09 and 19, but we certainly are, we've started to climb out of the basement in 2015. Is that accurate?
That is accurate, Chairman. We gained about 4.9% from 17 to 18, and then that 6% that I mentioned earlier from 18 to 19. And like I said, that's early indications are that's going to continue for the next 2 years, most likely.
Great, thank you very much. Any questions for Tom? Yes, sir, Mr. Webster.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Tom, Burritt, Sherland, Harrison, combined there, the number, I'm looking at table 1.
Yes, sir.
The number of complaints were 16 there. When I talked to the assessor for those 3 townships, she indicated that it had to do something with the state formula.
Yes, so all farmland equalized assessed value is based on the certified productivity indexes, which is issued by the state. There's a farmland technical committee that meets in Springfield every year, and they look at interest rates, they look at crop prices, and then they set that productivity index. We have our own farmland assessment review committee committee meeting every May in our office, and they certify those values. So when we do receive a complaint on a parcel that's assessed as farm, if there's no home site on it, those values are generated by the state. So there's 3 different things though that we can do in our office. One, we can look at the land use, how the land is being assessed. If it's in cropland, it's assessed at full EAV. If it's other farmland, it's 1/6 of that. Permanent pasture is 1/3 of that. So we can look at that based on 2018 aerials. They just flew in the spring of 2018. We can also look at, there's been a lot of flooding, obviously this spring especially. The state does allow for a flood PI debasement. I've been out to various properties in the Rockton area and met with property owners. So that's an option as well. That would be initiated between our office and the property tax owner. And then also the property tax owner, they can procure an alternate soil sample. I haven't seen this done. It's what I've heard is fairly expensive, but if they want to submit an alternate soil sample, that can be admitted into evidence for the board review at that time as well.
So I guess that's the reason then that the northwest part of the county is why I see the most complaints under farm.
Correct.
Because so much open farmland.
Yes, sir.
And District 1, District 2 carry the most ag area apparently.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Mr. Webster. Any other follow-ups for Mr. Hodges? Seeing none, we'll move on. Any other department head comments? Seeing none, we'll move on to standing committee reports. Finance Committee, Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Finance Committee has 7 items tonight. The first one is a budget amendment 2020-001 teen pregnancy grant to be laid over. And
Thank
I
you.
move to suspend the rules to get this voted on tonight.
We got a motion by Mr. Salgado to suspend the rules, which will allow us to separately vote this evening. A second by Mr. Westcott, Mr. Hoffman, and Mrs. Gorel. The motion to suspend is before the board. Any discussion on suspending the rules? All those in favor of suspending the rules signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. We've suspended the rules. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I move to approve Budget Amendment 2020-001, Teen Pregnancy Grant, and I so move.
We got a motion by Mr. Salgado on Budget Amendment 2020-001, Teen Pregnancy Grant. Second by Mr. Westcott, Hoffman, Mrs. Gorel, and Mr. Gurl. Item is now before the board for consideration. Any questions or comments? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much, Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next item is Budget Amendment 2019-033, the Ware Building Improvements to be laid over.
Thank you.
And so I move to suspend the rules and vote on this tonight.
Motion by Mr. Salgado to suspend the rules. May I have a second? Second by Mr. Gurl. Thank you. Motion to suspend is before the board. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of suspending the rules signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. We've suspended the rules. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I move to approve Budget Amendment 2019-033, Ware Building Improvements.
Motion by Mr. Salgado on Budget Amendment 2019-003, the Ware Building Improvements. Second by Mr. Gurl. Thank you. Item is now before the board. I believe there was a little bit of a clarification given at committee as to why this is coming forward. This was previously approved by the board, I believe. Steve, do you want to give clarity to that?
Yes, I believe this was approved by the board back in April, May, somewhere in that area. However, at that time, it didn't appear that there was a budget amendment to accompany the approval of the bid. So this is just approving the budget amendment for money that's already been approved for 2019.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. Any other comments, questions by board members? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Please note, no vote for Mr. McDonald, yes vote for all other members present. Motion passes. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next item is Budget Amendment 2020-002, Probation Department. And that's to be laid over, and I'd like to move to suspend the rules and vote on it.
We got a motion by Mr. Salgado to on 2020-002 Probation Department. Motion to suspend. Motion and a second by Mr. Gurl. Motion to suspend is now before the board. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of suspending the rules signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes. We've suspended the rules. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'd like to move to approve Budget Amendment 2020-002, Probation Department.
Motion by Mr. Salgado on 2020-002 Probation Department. May I have a second, please? Second by Mr. Gurl. Thank you. Item is now before the board. Any comments or discussion? Could we get a quick, maybe 30-second overview by either Mr. Salgado or Steve, or somebody speak to this?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The state has agreed to fund 4 additional positions within the probation department, 2 of the existing positions that we have, 2 additional pretrial sentence positions. So the net effect, once you take into effect all the costs and so on, will be a positive amount back to the county of about $40,000 this year. So.
I believe the follow-up question that usually Mr. Schultz always asks is if this could be a reoccurring type funding stream, and I think the belief was it would be.
Yes, it is. Ms. Jarvis indicated that normally once the state approves a voucher for a particular position, that those funds continue on in the future.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's the exact same question we asked in committee, and Ms. Jarvis answered that question, saying that they're pretty much guaranteed that they will get that same funding continuing going forward. That was one of the questions, that we don't want to hire and then we lose the grant, then we have to somehow, relinquish those positions. So it was addressed at that meeting. Yes.
Any other comments or questions by board members? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much, Mr. Salgado.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's 3 resolutions tonight. I'll read them individually, but they're all similar related to workman's comp settlements. So the first one is a resolution authorizing settlement of claim against the County of Winnebago entitled Robert Zimmerman versus the Winnebago County in the amount of $18,013.56, and I so move.
Motion by Mr. Salgado on the work comp claim involving Robert Zimmerman in the amount of $18,000 and change. Second by Mr. Girl. Any comments, questions by board members? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. Thank you very much, Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next item is a resolution authorizing settlement of claim against the County of Winnebago entitled Frank Ventry versus the Winnebago County in the amount of $16,998.76, and I so move.
Motion by Mr. Salgado on the work comp claim related to Frank Venturi v. Winnebago for almost $17,000. May I have a second, please? Mr. Girl, thank you very much. Any questions or comments on this item? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The final resolution authorizing settlement of a claim against the County of Winnebago entitled Scott Johnson versus Winnebago County in the amount of $35,573.52, and I so move.
Motion by Mr. Salgado on the work comp claim related to Scott Johnson v. Winnebago in the amount of $35,000 and change. May I have a second? Second by Mr. Girl. Thank you very much. Item is now before the board for approval. Any discussion or comments by board members? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much, Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 2 items that I'd like to address. The one is the CPI plan, as discussed back in 2019, earlier this year. Carla Pascal, our previous administrator, proposed a $30 million plan capturing all these different things that we need across the county on capital projects. So it was proposed bonding out and finding the revenue sources from that, from host fees, various other revenues. So it's something that we need to look for more in detail. I know Mr. Chapman is taking a stab at it. I don't know if he wants to address anything at this point in time. I know it's premature, but he's looking into it to kind of rehash that plan again to see what direction we need to go. And so from that standpoint, we had great discussion about the Axion proposal from the Sheriff's Department for $2.5 million, knowing that the first year would be a no cost, but then we would have to, the second to the 5 year, we would have to find a ways to fund that. So various opportunities of revenue came up in those proposals. However, nothing has solidified at this point in time. So there is still dialogue between Mr. Chapman, myself, and the Sheriff's Department trying to figure out where we can find that funding. I just want to caution everybody that we start locking ourselves into a contract. I know that we can obviously put a clause in there that if we don't find the funding, we can pull out of the contract. But from my perspective, we cannot just assume. It's kind of like saying, I'm going to get a raise next year, so therefore I'm going to go out and buy me the nice fancy house or something that's going to upgrade, and then that promise is broken or I don't get that, and therefore, I got to come up with the money. So just for that sake, check and balances, I just want to put it out there. That's why I'm very cautious on this, and I ask the questions, how we're going to finance this. It's not that it's not important or it's not needed, but we have to be responsible, cognizant about our finances. And we just came out of a budget that we just passed recently, and we knew where our deficit was, so we worked on that aspect of it. So, we're looking at it. We know we're on a tight deadline, before the fiscal end of the year. The pricing is guaranteed until that point. So we are cognizant of that. We're working on that direction. So there's still talks to be talking about that. And the CPI plan, like I said, it's something critical that was addressed through the finance, through the past administrator issuing a $30 million. I know there was discussion. I think Mr. Fellis brought up the point like, hey, you know, can we break this down into pieces? Can we have more information on that and on the critical needs throughout the county? So that's one piece. The other piece I would like to address, and I appreciate WREX coming here today and having us today. I just want to say that Mr. McDonald and myself got the letter from the Attorney General. I sent it over to Mr. Kurlinkus and the State's Attorney's Office. They responded. They sent the recordings to see whether there was a FOIable violation there based on Closed Meetings Act and all that. So the State's Attorney came back, Attorney General gave out that. I know Mr. McDonald, he can, I can't speak for Mr. McDonald. If he promised a 60-day, whatever the case may be, from my standpoint, I stand behind my attorney, and it was advised by my attorney that they were going to fight an appeal for that. So that's for the record. So I was aware that the State's Attorney would file an appeal for it, because they felt as legal counsel from their perspective of doing that we didn't violate anything. So going forward, I do request that you follow up with the State's Attorney, and I'm asking the State's Attorney tonight if she could draft out a letter of communication of why those things have not been released, so everybody is on the same page. So, Ms. Hyde-Ross, I'm asking you if you wouldn't mind, you know, communicating that, because obviously I think there's a misunderstanding that we're not complying or that we're not trying to be transparent. That's not the case. I can tell you from personal experience, what I've been going through this process, that's not the case here. No one here is trying to hide anything or say that we did or didn't do whatever the case may be. So I just want to go on the record for that, and I wanted to address, and I do thank you for coming out, bringing it to our attention. I haven't got any phone calls. I don't know, Mr. McDonald has gotten, seems like you've gotten multiple of the calls, requests. I have not. So if you were to come to me, I would defer back to my sister attorney, which is my legal counsel on that. So I just wanted to address that. And I believe, Mr. Chapman, do we have a meeting next week sometime for finance? Is that the plan?
I believe that we're going to have a meeting on Thursday night, combined meeting of finance and operations.
All right, thank you. And that's all we got.
Thank you very much, Mr. Salgado. The only thing I would just add in to close off, since Mr. Salgado brought that issue back up, the only thing I wasn't clear on that I'd want to be clear on going forward, whether it involves me directly or secondarily, is the decision made to appeal something when there's an Attorney General ruling, so that there was not an official board action that I'm aware of where we said, yes, let's appeal that. And I can only speak for myself, and if I missed a conversation, I apologize. That is possible. But we didn't make an action as a board. The board didn't take action to appeal, but then the appeal itself became, I think, as much or more part of the story than anything else. And I guess my question is, going forward, not just not fighting about what happened then on May 2nd, but maybe saying in the future, if there's going to be an appeal of anything related to anything of this magnitude or nature or public, certainly public scrutiny, that there's a decision made by the board or majority of the board to appeal, because I think some people were caught off guard there was even an appeal in the first place. I know that I wasn't as aware of that process, and forgive me if I missed something. I could have, but I don't think I did. So I would just say going forward, that would be really important if we're going to appeal things. Yes, just follow up, Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe the two chairmen, myself and Mr. McDonald, were the ones that were asked to release the information to the Attorney General so they can investigate whether there was a violation or not. I complied. I sent it to Mr. Kurlinkus. Mr. Kurlinkus got the tapes, whatever, sent it off. Decision was made, and it was, from my standpoint, that it was communicated to me And I said, that's fine, let's appeal. If there's a violation, then let's appeal. So I don't know what you would like me to disclose to every single person. I mean, you know, from my standpoint, I think, from my perspective, we did what needed to be done within that timeline to comply, and we obviously were in our rights to appeal. And so we did so. I don't think once again, I don't think there was any malpractice or intention or willfulness, whatever you want to call it, to actually circumvent the system and or go around you or any of the county board members. So that's where, you know, from my perspective, it was attained to the chairman of the finance and operations. And so we complied, we did what we needed to do, and that's where we're at. So I don't know, I guess, I don't know if you want it in writing, from my perspective, we are where we are. And like I said, if you need additional information, please reach out to the state's attorney's office. And I'm sure they're willing to comply with you and address those issues, not just yourself, but you know, any of the media partners that we have here. So that's all I'm saying, just defer to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Salgado. State's Attorney.
It's not up. Okay.
Oh, there you go.
Well, first of all, the two committee chairmen, Mr. McDonald and Mr. Salgado, because it was a joint meeting, were chairman of that particular meeting. So I did consult with both chairpersons of that committee and advised them that it was my legal opinion that we should appeal the Attorney General's original decision. I am their legal advisor and legal counsel, and it's my duty to ensure that nothing is released that could put the county in a position where they might be involved in a lawsuit. And so we did discuss that. The body that creates the closed session meetings are the ones that have the process and follow the procedures to determine whether or not those closed session meetings are released. My office provides advice routinely to other departments regarding whether or not they are to release certain information, so this was no different. To be clear, Mr. Chairman, the Attorney General's opinion is not binding. It was an advisory recommendation opinion. I still feel, and I stand by my recommendation to Chairman Salgado and Chairman McDonald that at that particular time and at this particular time that those meetings should remain closed. Obviously, within the Opens Meetings Act, there is a procedure that all of the committee chairs follow to review closed session minutes, and they determine at what time or if or when those meetings, closed meeting minutes should be released, and this is no different from that.
Thank you very much for your comments, and Mr. Salgado, I do appreciate your comments in particular. I would just say this is, we've had differences of opinion, but I can honestly say I don't believe that either committee chair is operating in a manner that isn't trying to do good. I absolutely believe that. Where I'm frustrated is that had I known there was this, I would have loved to there at least be a committee decision or a board decision, so we all make a decision to walk into this, because the scrutiny from the public is not germane to the lawyer making the recommendation. Is I've gotten a bunch of calls on something that I was not part of at all. So I guess my point is, since we all have to defend it, then we should all be part of the discussion, or at least have a process going forward. I'm not in any way talking about intent. What I would say, though, is it wasn't a small deal, because I read about it in the paper multiple times, and I've been hit by community members, and I've also done a fair amount of defending the intentions of, I think, those involved. And all I'm saying is my only concern from a process standpoint, not an intention standpoint, is if this would ever happen in the future, putting it on a committee chair instead of the board or a committee to take action and own it as a group. I think that's probably better going forward. I'll leave it at that. I don't have anything else to say. I'm in no way being critical of the individual committee chairs. I'm trying to say, if I were part of the process, I'd stand there with you, but it just got disjointed and siloed a little bit because the decision was made in silo, due respect.
If I could just comment on that, Mr. Chairman. With all due respect, the process was followed with the decision that was made in consultation with the chairmen of the joint committee. So the process was followed, and that's what I'm trying to explain to you and to those who may not understand the process.
Thank you very much. Next item of business, zoning committee, Mr. Webster.
Thank you. Zoning Committee has no report.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. Economic Development, Mr. Billick.
Thank you, Chairman. Today, the Economic Development has two matters of business. The first being a motion to approve an ordinance amending the Winnebago County Code of Ordinances by the addition of Article 6 to Chapter 78, imposing a county cannabis retailer's occupation tax.
So we have a motion on the ordinance related to the cannabis retailer's occupation tax that was laid over from October 21st, or 24th, excuse me, a second by Mr. Fellers. Any other seconds? So we have a motion and a second. The item is now before the board for action. Any questions or comments by board members?
If I may actually start off, we do have an update, Ms. Height-Ross. There was a new bill that was coming through on the state level, trailer.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to update the county board. As I indicated when I presented a short presentation to all of you a few weeks ago regarding the Cannabis Tax Regulation Act, there was a trailer bill that came through yesterday, passed the House. One of the significant changes that you need to be apprised of is that the state in this bill has moved up the date of collecting taxes from September 1st, 2020 to July 1st of 2020. They have also moved up the date in which a municipality can pass and file their taxing ordinance with the state, so that has been moved up from June of 2020 to April 1st of 2020. The other significant change in that trailer bill is that it proposes that those retail tobacco stores may permit individuals to smoke cannabis in their establishments. And so, as you know, the original bill said you can only smoke on your own private property. Now, again, we're still digesting the trailer bill that passed the House yesterday, but those are two significant changes I wanted to just update all of you on.
Thank you very much. You're welcome. Any other comments, Mr. Billick? No, okay. Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. State Attorney Height-Ross, so the action we're considering tonight doesn't have any effect on that issue of people smoking at a location other than their home, right? This is just passing this doesn't. I guess I'm asking this because I think that's a bad idea. And so I don't want to do anything here that would endorse that.
No, this does not. The main thing that this impacts is the first provision that I read to you, which increases or moves up the date by which the state will collect taxes and moves up the date by which a municipality can have their local ordinance on file.
Okay,
So
thank you.
as I indicated previously, if you're going to pass it, you should do it sooner than later.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Billick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, just to give a quick kind of piece of advice, piece of update on this portion that we laid over. This is only in regards to the taxing amount. As far as not allowing it, that is not something that the Economic Development Committee decides, and this is not what this is actually going to be deciding on, whether it permits any form of usage. Me and Marilyn and Chris have merely just tried to update everyone on what the legalities are so far and what we know about. Due to the questions that were being asked during the committees, and also to keep everybody as informed as possible, because we're going to be meeting a lot more of these issues head on very shortly. And like I said, we are also having meetings with Jaime and Aaron Booker and Dr. Martell, and we're going to be setting that up very soon, I hope, and getting together on that. and meeting to divulge on which way the funds are going to be distributed, if we're going to decide which way and who it would go to, or what departments majorly impacted by this, which is obviously the public safety and state's attorney's office and such. So this is just approving the tax, which we're allowed to approve in the unincorporated areas and the incorporated areas. Has nothing to do with allowing, not allowing, or anything like that.
Very good synopsis. Thank you, Mr. Batita.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to amend this to eliminate the 3.75 tax in unincorporated areas. That'd be Article 6, tab number 1, paragraph A. Just a section that imposes taxes on unincorporated areas.
So, and you're going to help me clean this up. We have a motion by Mr. Batita to remove the unincorporated Winnebago County portion of the language that would allow for a tax in the unincorporated portions of Winnebago County.
Right.
Is that correct? So we have a motion by Mr. Batita that would pull out and remove and delete language related to any taxing in the unincorporated portions of Winnebago County, leaving it in the municipal parts of Winnebago County.
Correct.
Okay. We have a motion by Mr. Batita related to the deletion of the unincorporated portion. Do I have a second? I do not see a second. We have a motion, no second, so the item will just be read in as a motion, and it fails for lack of a second. And we'll move forward with the item that had been previously motioned and seconded in, that laid over from the last meeting, that is still now before the board. Any follow-up questions or comments on the item before the board? Seeing none, all those in favor, actually, I might have the clerk call the roll on this one. I'll go ahead and have the clerk call the roll. Yeah.
Mr. Hoffman.
Yes.
Mr. Kelly.
Yes.
Mr. McDonald.
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors is absent. Mrs. Red. Yes. Mr. Salgado.
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni.
Yes.
Mr. Webster.
Yes.
Mr. Westcott.
Yes.
Mr. Arena.
Yes.
Mr. Billich.
Yes.
Mr. Booker.
Yes.
Mr. Boomer. Mr. Butita.
No.
Mrs. Crosby. Yes. Mr. Fellers.
Yes.
Mr. Gurl.
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel.
Yes.
3 absent, 1 no. Motion passes.
Okay, maybe we didn't need a roll call. My fault. Sorry about that. Mr. Billick. Motion passes, Mr. Billick.
Thank you, Chairman. Our next order of business is an ordinance amending the Winnebago County Code of Ordinances to provide for video gaming as allowed by the Illinois Video Gaming Act, and I so move.
We have a motion by Mr. Billick on the ordinance related to the video gaming. May I have a second, please? Mr. Butita, Mr. Gurl, thank you very much. Item is now before the board for discussion. Do you mind, Mr. Billick, giving a 30-second high level on that?
So basically what this is actually proposing is just actually making us follow along with exactly what the state already mandated as the new gaming policy goes, as far as for licensing fees for the machines, per machine amounts, as well as the making us follow along with what they allowed for in the unincorporated areas as far as truck stops go to get up to 10 machines, but they also, that falls under whatever the state decides under their gaming commission. So aside from that, all it does is it brings us up to code on what the state of Illinois had already passed earlier this summer.
Okay. Thank you very much. Any questions or comments by board members? Okay. With that, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? Motion passes. Thank you very much, Mr. Billick.
Thank you, Chairman. That concludes our.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move Personnel and Policy Committee up and flip-flop it with Operations, if that's okay. Without Mr. Fiducia, do we have a pinch hitter for the Personnel and Policy Committee? Mr. Boomer, thank you.
Here we go. We have 2 resolutions in personnel and policies, both having to do with workman compensation
Insurance,
and liability. sorry. Workman compensation liability claims to an agreement with Gallagher and Bassett for third-party administrative fees for workman's compensation liability fees. Perfect. And do I have to read both of them?
No, let's do that one. Thank you very much. So we got a motion by Mr. Boomer on item 2 under personnel and policies related to Gallagher Bassett, third-party administrator for work comp and liability claims. May I have a second to Mr. Boomer's motion? Mr. Hoffman, Mr. Webster, Mrs. Gorel. Item has been motioned and seconded and is now before the board for discussion. Oh, I'm sorry, Mrs. Red also on a second. We'll note that for the record. Any discussion by board members on item 2 related to this agreement? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much, Mr. Boomer, for item 3.
Yeah, let me get this for Mrs. Crosby. Resolution authorizing the execution and renewal agreement with Arthur and Gallagher for property casualty and workman's compensation cover.
We've got a motion by Mr. Boomer on the agreement with Arthur J. Gallagher for property casualty and worker comp coverage, a second by Mrs. Gorel. Item is now before the board, and Mr. Webster on the second. Item is now before the board. Any discussion or comments on this renewal? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes. Thank you very much, Mr. Boomer.
And we have no animal reports, so that concludes it.
I'm kind of disappointed, actually. Thank you, Mr. Boomer. Next item of business, Operations Administrative Committee. If the board will indulge me, we have a closed session I need to get us into to talk about a couple of items. Let me read the exception. A public body may hold closed session to consider the following subjects. This is item 11, litigation, when an action against, affecting, or on behalf of the particular body public has been filed and is pending before a court or administrative tribunal, or when the public body finds that an action is probable or imminent, in which case the basis for the finding shall be recorded and entered into the minutes of the closed session. I have a motion, if I would entertain a motion to go to closed session. Mr. Fellers made the motion. May I have a second to go to closed session, please? I have no second. I'm looking for a second to go to closed session. Thank you, Mr. Kelly, Mrs. Crosby on the second. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? No. Looks like we're not going to closed session tonight to talk about litigation or threatened litigation. So we'll stay in open session, and that brings up the Operations and Administrative Committee. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've got, we've got one ordinance tonight. I make a motion to send it back to committee.
We have a motion by Mr. McDonald on the ordinance amending Chapter 70 of the Winnebago County Code of Ordinances related to waste haulers and solid waste that was laid over from October 24th. And we have a second by Mr. Boomer, Mr. Tassoni, and Mr. Westcott, and Mr. Hoffman. The motion to lay over is now before the board.
Send back.
I'm sorry, the motion to send back to committee, the Operations Committee, is now before the board. Any discussion or comments? Mrs. Crosby.
Could I have the rationale, please?
One thing, in my opinion, Mr. Zog would not be happy with this is it doesn't address his concerns. It doesn't fix the original intent and purpose. And then there's several other things. Mr. Tassoni has great points and a few other things that need to be cleaned up.
So explain the few other things.
So,
What are the few other things that need to be cleaned up?
they're numerous, Ms. Crosby.
I know they are, but you didn't, I just want to know the rationale, because we've worked on this for 6 months. And perhaps it doesn't address all the issues, but it addresses some of the issues, and we can still work on the issues regarding the landfill. So we don't have to put this aside in order to move that agenda forward. For
You're
some
welcome
reason
to-
you want to.
You can vote no to send it back, ma'am.
Is there anyone who could speak to this? I saw a couple hands up. I'll go Mrs. Gorel and then Mr. Arena. Mrs. Gorel. Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was contacted and informed that members of the industry wanted to have the opportunity to testify, to have their opinion known on the ordinance, and apparently they weren't aware of it when it came through committee the first time. I was under the impression that they had been more involved in the conversation because this is a second go-around on this, and apparently they were not. So I view this just as it's a 2-week delay. I assume we'll meet next week and give them the opportunity to come in and speak their mind. And, for that reason, I think it's justified to send it back to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Rena. Just to follow up, who wanted to testify? Just so I'm clear, who wanted to share their thoughts?
I think it was, the phone call I got was folks from the landfill wanted to testify, but then I got a separate phone call that said the waste haulers also wanted to testify. So I think everyone who's involved who would be affected by the regulation wanted to have the opportunity to voice their opinion, was what I was told. They had, and as Mr. McDonald said, that they had various points to make.
Okay, no, I appreciate you sharing that. Thank you very much, Mr. Rena. Mrs. Gorel.
Thank you, Chairman. My understanding of this, we do not own the Winnebago landfill. Someone else owns it. The only thing that we are responsible for as a county is the county health department regulating what's on the outside that goes on, and that's with them hauling stuff into our community and having that trash go all over our neighborhoods, our highways, and that's what we're responsible for. We are not responsible for the odor that's coming out of there. That's the Illinois EPA that's in charge of that. The state needs to take care of those. I think we're confusing what we are actually liable for and to take care of and what we aren't. And I don't know why we are continuing to go on and on and on. If anybody wanted to come forward on this before, they've only had 6 months to do it. Now all of a sudden they're coming forward. And we just keep putting it off, putting it off, putting it off. The people aren't getting satisfied because it keeps getting put off because we gotta listen to this one, that one, and the other one. The landfill needs to look up to their own responsibility. And they're the ones who have to pay for their responsibility inside that fence. We are responsible for keeping our neighborhoods healthy, and that's keeping them clean. And let's keep that in mind. Let's not confuse the two. And if other people want to keep talking about it, they can talk about it all they want. Talk about the inside because it's the odor. It's what's happening inside that fence, not what's happening outside. And outside is Winnebago County Health Department's responsibility. Keep that in mind, please. Thank you.
I'll address some of that, Ms. Grohl, as well. A $100 permit's not going to get them to stop dropping trash.
Really? Well, we'll find that
Well,
out, won't we? Because
one at a time, please. One at a time. Mrs. Gorel.
Thank you. Because if it doesn't stop it, then we can always amend it. But in the meantime, we need to get this done, get it started, and see where it really goes. Because if we keep dickering back and forth about, oh, you're charging me too much for this, or you're charging me too much for that, who's making the money on this? It sure isn't us. If we might be getting money off of a landfill, but the neighbors aren't getting, what's happening to those neighbors out there that have to put up with this? We aren't being fair to them. And our job is to be fair to outside that fence, not inside that fence. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Gorel. Just for a couple, I guess just for the record, my recollection, and correct me, Dr. Martell, if I'm wrong on anything here, I believe this discussion initially emanated back in mid-April. In May, it was moving, and the idea was with urgency, we were going to deal with the one thing that is the most germane to county influence, county government influence, because as I've been told, and again, if I'm wrong, you can correct me in front of 50 cameras and God, is that we do not control the IEPA regulatory piece. We cannot dictate that process because that's a state process. It doesn't mean we're happy with the speed of the process or we can't do some nudging. And I think Dr. Martell has been nudging very hard behind the scenes, to her credit. But my understanding was that we ran it through the health board, and then it came to committee at some time in the summer, and we received a letter from a lawyer, and the whole process started back over and went back to the health board, was amended. State's attorney's been very involved, Charlotte, and then it came through. So there's a lawyer that sent a letter back then in round one at what I thought was the 11th hour, because we did talk about this publicly, and kind of restarted the process. And now it came back through, and we've even gone further to reading it in on the board floor. This has been talked about, I think, in the media. It has been talked about by multiple board members on multiple occasions. And the landfill has had contact with us, because they've, hopefully sending us a big check next week that they owe us money on. But at the same time, since you didn't want to go into closed session, what seems odd to me is that I find it impossible that if they sent a letter, if their lawyer or representative or anybody is sending letters, that they didn't know. Like, how do you not know when you're directing your point person to send letters to us in the first place, and now we don't, now there's confusion at the last minute. I think that's why there's some frustration in the community, and now we have a second volley and a second letter, and we're talking about going backwards again. This is the one thing. Yes, I am, and I'm going to overrule you, and I am going to weigh in. I'm going to weigh in very clearly. I am not going to stop talking. I am not going to stop talking in this room until I am done talking and to make the point.
You don't have
I
the
am
order,
the.
Mr. Webster.
Hold,
You
Mr.
don't have the
Fellers.
floor.
I'm going to finish my comment. I'm going to finish my comment as the only person in this room elected countywide to represent the citizens of this community. I am going to finish my comment, Mr.
Point of
Webster.
order.
Mr. Fellers, hold. Mr. Webster, I'm going to finish my comments. I am going to absolutely be here all evening, and there's not another piece of business being done until I finish my point. Thank you very much. Absolutely, it's disingenuous to say that people didn't know about this discussion. It's absolutely disingenuous. That doesn't mean the board doesn't have the absolute authority to send it back to committee. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you all as a fellow elected representative of this community. Next, Mr. Fellers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to echo what Mr. Gorel said. It also has been said, we've been working on this for 8 months now, and if this is just another letter from another lawyer saying we're in trouble, we're just getting played on pushing it back. State's Attorney, you've reviewed this document, and do you have any additional concerns about the legal matters with it? I mean, it's been reviewed by the State's Attorney's office, and otherwise would be available, we could approve this without any objections?
I believe you could. Obviously, I'm happy to discuss any other potential legal matters in closed session if you have questions, but I believe the document is appropriate.
And Dr. Martell, we've been working on this for quite a while. Are you happy with the format that it's in? Okay, so it sounds like the only people that really are upset about this are the ones that might have to pay $100 fines. If we're gonna bend over backwards for them and not our citizens about the trash up and down I-39 and all around the Baxter Road and everywhere else, that's on you guys now. But I'm not gonna vote to send this back to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Fellers. Mr. Butita, then a follow-up by Mr. Arena.
Thank you. While I agree with Mr. McDonald that a $100 fine probably is not going to help, the ordinance does identify violations of $1,000 per instance for each day a violation exists. So I think that might catch people's attention.
Thank you, Mr. Butita. Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to clarify my earlier comments. So I'm a member of the Operations Committee, and we did receive a letter from an attorney the first time it came through. When it came back the second time, I assumed that there had been ongoing conversations with the attorney and that everything was worked out. I don't know if that happened or not, but what I can tell you is that when it was addressed in operations for the second time, no one else was there. A few of us asked a few questions. I'm eager to get this done also. I have a friend who travels on I-90 and keeps sending me videos of garbage flying out of trucks to just remind me that it needs to be taken care of, and I also want that to stop. All I'm suggesting is that someone's come forward and said, we didn't get a chance to be on the record with our opinion, and I would like to give them that opportunity. It's a 2-week delay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arena. Follow up by Mr. Fellers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This has been on the public record for 8 months. As has been said by the state's attorney, by members of this board, Mr. McDonald is standing right at the podium, and they can come and address us and deliver their concerns to us about this at any time. They could have joined us in committee. They could have been here. They just chose to right before the moment when we were going to pass this to all of a sudden take an interest. So again, if we want to get played, let's get played.
Thank you, Mr. Fellers. I would just add this is an amendment to a current ordinance that was originally created when, Dr. Martell? This is an amendment from an older ordinance, but it was originally created when? In the 70s. Oh, so we're updating an ordinance that was created before the establishment of the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency, I believe. So that's how old that is. Mr. Boomer.
Question?
We have a motion by Mr. Boomer to call the question. We have a second by Mr. Westcott and Mr. Hoffman. We have a motion, a second to call the question, which would end debate on the motion to move this back to committee. And with that, I will ask the clerk to call the roll. A yes vote ends discussion. It doesn't pass or fail the motion to move it to committee. It merely ends the debate on the floor about something that we're talking about debating more in committee. A yes vote ends the debate. A no vote keeps it going.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kelly?
Yes.
Mr. McDonald?
Yes.
Mrs. Rudd? Mr. Salgado?
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni?
Yes.
Mr. Webster?
Yes.
Mr. Westcott?
Yes.
Mr. Arena?
Yes.
Mr. Billich?
Yes.
Mr. Booker?
No.
Mr. Boomer?
Yes.
Mr. Butita? Mrs. Crosby?
No.
Mr. Fellers?
Yes.
Mr. Gurl?
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
3 absent, 2 no.
Passed.
Motion passes. We've ended discussion. Now the vote on whether or not to send it back to committee. A yes vote sends it to committee. A no vote keeps it here on the board floor. Again, I'll ask the clerk to call the roll. A yes vote sends it to committee. No vote keeps it here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McDonald?
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors is absent. Mrs. Rudd? Yes. Mr. Salgado?
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni?
Yes.
Mr. Webster?
Yes.
Mr. Westcott?
Yes.
Mr. Arena?
Yes.
Mr. Billich?
Yes.
Mr. Booker?
No.
Mr. Boomer?
Yes.
Mr. Butita?
No.
Mrs. Crosby?
No.
Mr. Fellers?
No.
Fiducia is absent. Mr. Gurl?
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel?
No.
Mr. Hoffman?
No.
Mr. Kelly?
No.
Motion passes.
Motion passes. We've sent the item back to committee. Look for that in an upcoming Operations Committee agenda. Thank you very much. Mr. McDonald.
That concludes the report. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other items related to committees? Public Works? Public Works Committee? I'm sorry, Mr. Tassoni? Oh, I'm sorry.
Thanks, Chairman. We have no report.
Thank you very much. Public Safety Committee, Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Chairman. No report. We've got a Public Safety Committee meeting scheduled for next Wednesday night.
Thank you very much. Next item of business, unfinished business, board appointment, the reappointment of Edward Herman, Davis, Illinois, October 19th through of 19 through October 2024. May I please have a motion? I believe this item laid over at the last board meeting. Motion by Mr. Gurl. May I please have a second? Mr. Fellers. Item is now before the board under unfinished business. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? We've reappointed Mr. Herman. Thank you very much. Next item of business, new business. I'm just going to ask Mr. Dornbush. Chris, could you, this is going to committee, to Mr. Billick's Economic Development Committee. This is something that needs to be on everybody's radar. If you want more information, then please attend Mr. Billick's Economic Development Committee. Could you just speak to that for 30 seconds, Chris?
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this is essentially a piggyback IGA for abandoned properties. It's piggyback onto the land bank IGA that was approved January 24th of this past year. What it essentially does, it would allow the R1PC to act upon court proceedings for properties that the county has authority over, so that they can try to obtain ownership and take the properties. The proceedings of taking the property would still follow the land bank board approval, that the committee that was formed. Each entity has a representative on there, so they vote at the land bank board. If it was approved, it would move forward, and then if it's under, say, the city of Rockford's jurisdiction, the chief elected official would have to still give a verbal okay, or they could veto it. If it falls in unincorporated Winnebago County, they would ask the chairman whether he wants to go forward with it or not. For partners that are not in, are not part of the land bank yet, for example, say the village of Durand, the chairman would also be able to ask for it because it defaults back to the county. There's no cost burden associated with this. It's just kind of a housekeeping thing that goes along with it, because the land bank entity, to my understanding, cannot actually take, does not actually have the authority until this IGA were to come through with it, to take possession.
Thank you, Mr. Dornbush. So that'll be going to Economic Development Committee here in the next cycle, the next week. Mr. Billich is shaking his head yes. Mr. Arena has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dornbush, is this for all properties or just the property identified in Exhibit A in the document?
To my understanding, that's just an example of what it would look like. Each property would not have to come through the entire county board. It would just be for abandoned properties, basically properties that are 2 years plus with delinquent taxes and have been vacant.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you very much. We'll move on. So I've been asked by the state's attorney, and I'll give as much clarity as I possibly can here. We're going to ask, if you don't want to, that's okay. The state's attorney would like to give an update in closed session because it is in the best interest of the county, and I'll even share the topic. The topic is opioid litigation. What she is able to share in closed session, I think, is appropriate for the entire board to hear. But I also think it's appropriate to say it is about opioid litigation. It is not about other items related to litigation or personnel or anything like that. Before we go there, I just want to say something for the record, though, is that tonight we had an issue that I just want to speak to very clearly. This is a board meeting. I'm never going to stop a board member from sharing his or her opinion. It is disappointing, respectfully, that when we're talking about continuing a discussion about a topic that clearly is a hot topic in the community, that clearly is a hot topic on this board, that we end discussion on it, and that we have a board member that wants me to stop talking but was perfectly okay with a committee chair or two making a decision on their own with a state's attorney to appeal an attorney general discussion, but yet I'm not allowed as an elected official to speak in a meeting that I have the floor on. And I find that absolutely disturbing to good government. And I'm sorry if we disagree on that. With that, I would entertain a motion to go to closed session for opioid litigation. I would motion by Mr. Fellers.
We have a motion.
We have a motion, Mr. Fellers.
I hand up and you saw it. I wanted to respond to your comments.
You'd like to respond? Then I think it's only fair to allow you to do that. So we'll hold for 1 second. Mr. Webster, go ahead.
Thank you. And yes, we did have a good dialogue going there. And the point, when I made the point of order, was about the discussion and debate should be among board members. That's exactly what it should be. And you know that. And I would turn to the state's attorney to render that opinion, because under ordinance, you run the meeting, but it's not your position to take part in debate and discussion. And so you can take part in debate and discussion at committee meetings anytime you like. But under ordinance, on the board floor, that is not the job of the chairman. And I turn to our state's attorney to clarify that, please.
Please
All of you
get every
have a
word of
memo
this
on
in the
that.
minutes.
All of you have a memo on that.
Yeah, you sent out a memo on that one time already.
Yes, I did.
Is this going to be the same memo again?
The memo remains my opinion.
That's my point. That's the way the ordinance reads.
There is no language in our ordinance that says I cannot speak. If you would like to bring forward an ordinance, sir, that says that Chairman Haney is the only person elected to anything in this county or on payroll anywhere in this county that cannot speak, feel free to do so.
Thank you.
Mr. Hoffman.
I didn't make that ordinance. It's on the books.
Mr. Hoffman.
Thank you, Chairman. this is not to get into all this, but I do want to ask a question so we don't get much eruption as we did just a minute ago. For the state's attorney, if somebody calls a point of order, like Mr. Webster did, is it okay then for another board member to call a point of order against the person who just called a point of order?
If I may, thank Chairman, is that all right if I respond?
Yes, please do.
The way that points of orders work according to Robert's rules is the point of order can be made, the chairman can deny the point of order, and then ultimately the person who had raised the point of order can call for a vote on overriding the chairman's decision. You agree with me, Mr. Fellers?
I do.
And unlike that other business, that is clearly laid out in our ordinance. Thank you, Mr. Hoffman. Thank you. So we have a motion by Mr. Fellers and I believe a second by Mrs. Crosby to go to closed session to discuss opioid litigation. Yes, and I do need to read the disclaimer. Litigation when an action affecting or on behalf of the particular public body has been filed and is pending before a court or administrative tribunal, or when the public body finds an action is probable or imminent, in which case the basis for the finding shall be recorded and entered into the minutes of the closed meeting. We have a motion and a second to go into closed session related to opioid litigation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? We'll go into closed session. We'll start in 3 minutes. think we're back in open session here, and there was no action taken in closed session. With that, I'd entertain a motion to adjourn. Thank you, Mr. Hoffman. A second by Mr. Kelly. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Good night.